So now we're going to talk about the Age of Enlightenment in the 1700s. The Enlightenment era is linked with the scientific revolution and with figures like Voltaire and Isaac Newton. So this is the period in the world where we're applying reason and science to everything else and starting to really understand it better. So this can be quite challenging because it challenges traditional notions of religion, ways of understanding the world, and also politics. So funnily enough, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment spurred on the American and French revolutions. People that you need to know in the Enlightenment. So probably the most prominent one is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a philosopher whose political ideas influenced the French Revolution. He came up with the notion of the social contract, which discusses the give and take relationship between a ruler and his people. So at that time, it was pretty much given that you either ruled because you were the biggest, toughest guy around, or because you were the smartest guy around, or because God had preordained that you were the person who should rule. But what the social contract says is that you can only rule if you're also good to the people. So it implies a little bit of responsibility on both sides of the equation. Another very interesting Enlightenment thinker is Mary Wollstonecraft, who you may also know as the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. She wrote A Vindication on the Rights of Woman, which is an essay that argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, which was what was believed at the time, but only appear to be so because they lack education. So at this point in history, nobody educated their daughters, they only spent money on educating their sons. So obviously when you compare the two, the women look pretty silly. So what she suggests is that men and women should be treated as rational beings and educated. And she tries to imagine a social order founded on reason rather than these weird prejudices we seem to have against each other. So what do you do if you're asked to write in the style of the Enlightenment? Well, the first thing you're going to think about is the setting. So you want to pick somewhere that's relevant to the era, so somewhere with sort of like an air of science to it. So you might think of like a doctor's surgery, science labs, libraries, or even a gentleman's private study as good places to make your setting. But the other thing you want to think about is being very careful not to be what we call anachronistic, which means to put things out of time. So you don't want to give them machines in their laboratories that require electricity, for instance. So you might even want to do a little bit of research on the era. You want to use specific, concrete detail. This is a time in writing when we focused very much on realist writing. So lots and lots of concrete details means things like, rather than just saying there are a bunch of bottles on the table, you would say something like, there was a round bottom flask with a murky liquid in it on the table. So going for the specific rather than the general. You would also think about using light and dark imagery to set up what you're talking about. So maybe lamps or candlelight. So this kind of symbolism is used because of the light of truth and reason, which was associated with the Enlightenment, and the dark is the unknown or the mysterious. You might also think about little details that imply academia or the system of study. So things like the busts of Pythagoras or any other famous Greek or Roman thinker, leather-bound books, and even objects of naturalism. So even like maybe a case of stuffed birds might be on display. So once you've got your setting, what about the main character? Who are you going to base the story around? So usually it's going to be a man. It's going to be an upper class man who is a professional of some kind. So again, thinking about the Enlightenment themes, a doctor, a scientist, an historian. Usually someone who's a bit of a repressed loner and a workaholic. So they'll usually have a clever, rational mind and conservative values. So they'll be terribly polite and very organized and sort of not express a lot of what they're thinking, but maybe keep a meticulous journal. Their logical mind might help them to solve a mystery or a puzzle or to do an experiment. So almost thinking like the character of Sherlock Holmes, even though that's a later invention, but that's the sort of man you're thinking of. Reading list in terms of people you might mimic in order to write in this style, or even just concepts that you need to research without necessarily reading the whole book. So the first one that I'd recommend reading about, even if you don't read it, is A Vindication on the Rights of Woman, because Mary Wollstonecraft is a very cool lady, but also because it's a quite influential text. It's probably our first feminist piece of writing. Then we have Emile by Rousseau, which I wouldn't expect you to read because it's a quite dense philosophical book about the way people should be educated and brought to a natural moral reality. So you could read about that on Wikipedia. Another one you might have a look at is The Social Contract and read a little bit about it rather than reading the entire thing. Robinson Crusoe is probably one you could actually read. It's a novel by Daniel Defoe. We didn't really talk about him because he was a one-hit wonder. He pretty much only wrote this. But it's a story of a very reasonable, rational man who gets shipwrecked on a desert island. So our very first deserted island story. And he has to go around and make sense of his surroundings and find a way to live off the land. It's a survival story. But it gives you a very good insight to an Enlightenment character. Another thing that's more for researching concepts than reading would be John Locke, who's an English philosopher, and he discussed a concept called tabula rasa, which means the clean slate. So that might be worth reading about on Wikipedia as well. Finally, one that you should definitely give a go reading because it's short and very influential, is the Declaration of Independence by the American Founding Fathers. So this one's interesting because, again, it's non-fiction, but also it was a very influential document in the forming of the United States.